This episode is sponsored by Voltoro. Keep on listening and you'll find out more about how you can buy allocated gold when the Bitcoin bull run reaches its peak. This way, you don't have to deal with infinitely inflationary fiat or banks that freeze your account. Also, note that trading involves risks and the information presented is not financial advice. This episode is also sponsored by Wasabi Wallet. Go to wasabiwallet.io, download Wasabi for your OS, and significantly boost your network level and transaction privacy. Hi there, and welcome to Season 9, Episode 6 of the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I am Vlad, and my guest today is Ben Ark, and we're gonna talk about anarchy and the origins of anarchy. And if you don't know Ben Ark, then you can listen to the previous season when we recorded an episode where he spoke about the Bowser wallet, which is a hardware wallet that you can build yourself from a general purpose device. And it also plays a nice video game, so that when you go through some sort of border control, they're gonna think it's a video game console and leave you alone, most likely. And he also works on some sort of social networking service on the Lightning Network that's called Nostr. And I'm not sure if we're gonna talk about that today, but it's very interesting, even though it's in a very early phase of development. And he also works on LNbits, which is a very cool service on the Lightning Network, which allows you to both receive payments and create faucets from where people can withdraw amounts. And that's just really cool. It's one of the best Lightning applications that I've used. So if you're not using LNbits, I suppose you can install it on Raspberry Blitz. I suppose it's also on my node. It might be on Umbrel if you're running that kind of node. But it's just really good. Give it a try. So hi Ben, how do you do?
Yes, very good. I have a few corrections for you there.
Of course,
so,
yeah.
But no, it's an excellent introduction. But it is on Umbrel, LNbits. They've done a great job of, I think they Dockerize it. So it's not the most up-to-date version of LNbits, but I think they're working on that. So every time we make a commit to master, it'll then rebuild the Docker image they use. And I'm sure that was in the pipeline at some point. So hopefully it will be the most up-to-date LNbits at some point. But yeah, it's a lot of people use it on Umbrel. And we have like a guide on the LNbits repo as well for doing funky things like connecting to ClearNet through Tor and delivering your LNbits. So you can be behind Tor, but then, expose your LNbits installed to ClearNet. And the other thing is Nostr. Yeah, so Nostr isn't on Lightning Network. It's actually got nothing to do with Bitcoin, apart from most of the people working on it are also Bitcoiners, which explains why it's going so slow, because we're all distracted by building Bitcoin things. So we're not working on Nostr, which is a shame. But hopefully we'll all get sick and tired of the Bitcoin stuff sooner or later, and then we'll go back to working on Nostr for a little bit. But its gravity seems to be sucking in some really interesting people on the Nostr Telegram group. We've got Fiat Jaff, who's the protocol creator. But then we've also got Rockstar Dev has come in from B2C Pay Server, and Cooks as well has come in. And then I'm there as well. The thing I built on Nostr was a kind of like a Twitter clone. It's more of a proof of concept. It works. You go to nostr.com and check it out. It's using, because Nostr uses public key cryptography. So, as a user, you have your private key and your public key, and then you can, in my example, if you're publishing like a tweet, then you're signing that to say that you're publishing it, and then sending it to these relays, which then other people can pull that tweet from, and then people can follow me by just, following my public key. What's quite cool about it is in Nostr, we're using Schnorr signatures. So actually, all the testing for these Schnorr signature libraries, which are being built for Bitcoin, well, not all the testing, but a lot of the testing is actually happening on Nostr, because we're using those Schnorr signatures. And I'll have to report back that the Schnorr signatures are amazing. And I can see why there's been such a push for us to get them in Bitcoin. So that's Nostr. It's got nothing to do with Bitcoin, except that most of the people working on a Bitcoin is.
Right. So there's a lot going on which are working, but at the same time, we decided that. So the last time we spoke, we got into this topic a little bit. I recall that you started explaining some nuances there, but basically, right now we're about to talk about philosophy and more specifically about what anarchy is and what its origins are, as well as libertarianism and all of these individual freedom movements that started most likely in France in history, and maybe that the political movements and parties that supported them have changed through time, because these used to be leftist movements, right?
Yeah, I mean, up until very recently, it would be the sort of 1970s. It was a lot of terms such as anarchism and libertarianism, in fact, were co-opted by the likes of Milton Friedman and what's his name, Hayek. No, I think it's mostly Milton Friedman actually who co-opted anarchism for libertarianism, and then libertarianism itself was also, the term was also co-opted. It was always a leftist tradition. I mean, if you don't agree with that, then go edit the Wikipedia articles. I think it's like the second paragraph on the Wikipedia for libertarianism. You'll read all about how it's a leftist tradition because of, you know, people on the left believed liberty, equality, fraternity, the tricolor. So you have, you know, in order for people to have be liberated, there needs to be an element of equality among all people, or else you can't have liberty. It's a hand-in-hand thing. So that's where they originated from. But then it sort of shifted then towards more individualism and pursuit of self. But then, you know, I think we mentioned in the last podcast when we're talking about, you know, what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to do. Like, you know, your liberty is affected. You know, if you want to, I don't know, own another human being, you know, that's something we should not allow to do because it affects their liberty in a negative way. So society as a whole has said, no, that thing's not great. You can't do that. So there's an example of how it's okay to say if you have a liberty. Sorry, that's my telegram going off. If you have a liberty which has a negative impact on other people, then perhaps, you know, it's not a fair thing to have. And I don't think many people would argue with that when it comes to something like slavery.
Right. So what you're telling me in a nutshell is that personal liberty used to be an issue of the left until the 1970s when it was co-opted by writers like Milton Friedman and Hayek. How do you pronounce his name?
Hayek, yeah, but it wasn't. No, so Hayek wasn't. I think it was Milton Friedman who co-opted anarchism, and then libertarianism. I think maybe it was like Ayn Rand. So maybe it was a little bit earlier than the 1970s when it started to get co-opted. But there was always this. So Proudhon was the first anarchist. He's the first person who referred to himself as an anarchist. And then there's that famous quote, which is property is theft, property is liberty. And the point being that there's a difference between, yes, owning stuff. You have to have the ability to be able to own stuff. That's something which, you know, is important as a human being to have freedom. But then his argument would be, well, you know, if you own the means of production, so if you control how things are produced, then that has a negative impact on other people's liberty. And actually, there's an element of theft there. Maybe if you own the resources to produce things, the natural resources, which at that time, I suppose, were being heavily taken over from commons. So, you know, a lot of these resources were originally commons, and then they were stolen from people and then put into under private ownership, and then bought and sold under private ownership, which we still see today, actually, you know, in that race to find the cheapest materials to use to build the things which you're selling. They go to the poorest countries and exploit, you know, different environments to increase their profits and to get a nice cheap source of materials. So there is an element of theft there. If you this is what Proudhon would argue, if you have ownership over the means of production. But that doesn't mean that that you shouldn't have private property. It just means that you, just like that example with slavery, you can't own another human being, and then to that end, just you can't own the means of production. I'm not in 100% agreement with that. I would class myself as like a socialist anarchist. I would call myself a libertarian as well because I want liberty for people. I'm not 100% in agree. I think the way businesses have evolved and companies have evolved, some small to medium enterprises under that Dunbar number of say 150 people, the person who owns the capital, owns the means of production, they have kind of like interpersonal relationships with the people they work with, and there is some responsibility there. They know the people they're working with, and they know that their kids going to university or whatever, or maybe they need a little bit of extra money, and they'll try and help them out by giving a promotion, or I don't know. There's that sense of humanity there. I think the problem is when that scales up to the corporate level, then to me something like the corporate model it becomes very adversarial, and it's all about buffering those human interactions. So your Jeff Bezos is so far removed from his poorly paid workers on the shop floor that he just doesn't really care about them, and I think that then becomes something of a problem. So and I think it also becomes a problem when it comes to the world's resources. I think it then races to exhaust them, and that's why we have all these issues with environmental disasters and so on. So to me, when a corporation gets to a certain scale, would it make sense for that corporation to become a public commons in some way? Maybe some sort of decentralized autonomous organization, or what we would call back in the good old days a cooperative. Then would more people then have liberty if they were working in that cooperative and they weren't if someone else didn't own the means of production, if they sort of owned it amongst themselves, if the producers owned the means of production amongst themselves? And I think the answer is yes, of course, but obviously those things are really hard to make, and you need the right technology to make them. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't advocate them, and you shouldn't advocate the ability to build those things to be worked on and progressed. I mean, so you could take Nostar as an example. I like this. Most of them in there, they're fiercely, they would actually call themselves anarcho-capitalist or kind of libertarian in the US centric version of the word. But yeah, I said on the Nostar chat, I said, has private capital failed us? I mean, this is why if private capital, when it came to something like Twitter or Facebook, was successful, then people wouldn't be looking to make decentralized alternatives, which will give humans more freedom. When we create tweets and content, it wouldn't then become privately owned by a company which is largely unaccountable, and there's no sense of democracy there, and probably has a monopoly over a market. Another thought experiment which I do on this topic is if you have two Amazons, and then one of them's like, I mean, hypothetically, you have the current Amazon model we have now, it's a big corporation, and then hypothetically, in my parallel universe, just say that a decentralized Amazon, a cooperative Amazon, is actually possible and functional to the point where all the products on the decentralized Amazon are the exact same price as the products on the corporate Amazon, but that instead of, I don't know, the people who work for decentralized Amazon or the participants of decentralized Amazon, instead of them earning 70% of their value, the value they put into the system, they earn 99% of the value, and 1% goes to bounties to manage the system, maybe through some clever piece of software or whatever. Then knowing that, and you have those two choices available to you to buy your latest whatever, would you shop at the centralized Amazon or would you shop at the decentralized Amazon? And I think the answer for most people would be, of course, obviously, you would shop at the decentralized Amazon. When I've run this sort of experiment with some diehard libertarians, then they make a point of trying to kind of skip round, which one's got the cheapest prices, and which one's like runs the website runs better or whatever. They try kind of skip round the actual point of the thought experiment, but as a human being, you understand innately that a monopoly, which is controlled and regulated by people, a decentralized monopoly by like a decentralized Amazon, where the producers are getting most of the value, is far superior to a centralized Amazon, where you end up with a Jeff Bezos earning eye-watering amounts of money, which can't really be justified. And then people working within that organization not earning enough, a barely subsistence wage. So I'll put that one to you. Which one would you shop at, Vlad?
Well, I was about to crack a joke about having two Amazons fighting each other. It sounds like the plot of Wonder Woman 1984.
Yeah, maybe. George Orwell's an interesting one, actually, because a lot of people bring up 1984.
No. Wonder Woman 1984.
Oh, Wonder Woman 1984. Oh, right. No, I haven't. That's the new one, isn't it?
Yeah, you have no reason to watch it, but I did read the plot.
I like the first one. The first film was great. I mean, particularly, I've got a daughter, so it's great to see like a sort of strong female superhero role model. This didn't exist, like 10, 20 years ago. So I can't wait, because my daughter's too young now, but I can't wait to sit down and watch the Wonder Woman film with her.
No, but to answer your question, because I cracked a stupid joke and you didn't get it at first and then you got it and it wasn't funny. So never mind, never happened. So to answer your question, personally, I would go for the decentralized version just because I understand the implications. But most people, I guess, would not care as much and would just go for the lowest price.
Yeah, which is why I always have that caveat at the very beginning that just say, in my silly hypothetical scenario, which would never happen, that the prices on both of these things are exactly the same. Which, maybe that will never happen. So if you look at something like socialism, for example, you're advocating that the means of production is owned or regulated by the community as a whole. And that's really the bare bones definition of socialism. How people try and achieve that has some disastrous consequences, as we've seen with places like the USSR, where state takes control of production with this idea that they'll then hand it over to people after they've taken control of production, which obviously doesn't happen because people aren't made that way. Politicians aren't made that way. And I think Lenin actually called the USSR state capitalism and said it was a failed experiment before he died. Obviously, Stalin was in control at that point. It was a thoroughly miserable place to live, but they had good train services, actually, so on their credit. But so that's obviously disastrous, and that's for a lot of people, particularly Americans, I notice. That's where their minds jump to when you say something like socialism. But I think maybe for Europeans, it's not so much because, like in the UK, for example, we're very proud of our health service, which is a state-controlled health service. So the state has assumed the means of production, but we're still very proud of it because it works pretty well and people have access to healthcare without having to be terrified. If they get a chipped tooth or something, they have to be terrified about the price it's going to cost them, and they have to then try and pull out their own teeth to save a few bucks. And then obviously when people are having some sort of disaster happen, they've got, the kids are ill or something and they need to be in hospital, they're not having to deal with hospital fees, which I can't even imagine, to be honest, in countries where you have privatized healthcare. Interestingly, though, to try and bring it back round to anarchism, the NHS originally was an anarchist model. It was based on the, what were they called? The Friendly Societies in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, where I'm from. And it was an Iro Bevan, the Prime Minister, who then, after Churchill, brought in the National Health Service, which was based on, was it Merthyr? Yeah, was based on these friendly societies in Merthyr Tydfil. So they set up these friendly societies, which is where people donated some money, and you could be a member of this friendly society. I think it was probably for like coal miners. And then if you just kind of give a due, an amount every year or month or whatever, and then if anything ever happened to you, you would have access to healthcare and I think also education as well, maybe. But then they soon realised their coffers were quite big, and they could actually start offering their services to people who weren't actually paying into the friendly society, just within their local community. So quite often anarchists will point back to that when they'll say, NHS is sort of more of a socialist way of doing things. Well, I suppose a state socialist way of doing things, but those original friendly societies and that original health service which everyone could access to were pretty anarchist, from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
There's a quote actually by, I can't remember who it was, I think it was a trade unionist at the time, and they're like, "Oh, we thought Mr. Bevan was trying to turn the whole of the UK into Merthyr Tydfil." And that was at the time when he introduced the NHS. If you know Merthyr Tydfil, then you would understand why that was quite funny.
I have no idea what you said there with your accent when you tried to replicate somebody's voice.
Oh, of course, yeah. So it's a Welsh accent, yeah. But so my point being that a lot of these things are just decentralizing stuff, and it doesn't matter that you might be scared of certain words or concepts because you've got historically a bad reference from some version of it which doesn't encompass the whole thing. It doesn't really matter. Like, it's still the thing humanity's kind of progressing towards. Like, eventually, I imagine free markets will have very successful cooperatives, decentralized autonomous organizations and the like running throughout them, and people will have more liberty because of it. So
yeah, I think the biggest challenge for the concept of cooperatives is figuring out who owns which amount of the labor that gets put in, because they're gonna run into some sort of argument at some point.
Oh, of course, and this is again. I mean, this is often when people talk about socialism, and they think it's the denial of self, but it's not. Like, in a cooperative, you're acting for self. You're doing whatever's in your best interests within that cooperative. You have also, you want the cooperative to succeed, of course, because you're part of that cooperative, but you're also acting within your own self-interest. If you're voting for your department to get a larger share of the pie of the products you sell, then you're going to lobby and vote for that. It's so much more efficient to have a dictator. This is why historically democracy took a long time to happen before society could actually have democracy working. And why we had first we had like monarchy and feudalism, and then slowly ebbed our way towards democracy. And I don't know if you ever remember that. Did you watch Game of Thrones? Did you watch Game of Thrones?
I haven't watched it, no.
Have you not? Oh, okay. Well, there's a great scene at the end of that where they're trying to think of how to restructure society almost. And one of the main characters, kind of like the goofball joke character, this guy called Sam, he stands up and he's like, well, as we're saying we want to rule over people and we're splitting up these lands, why don't we let the people vote on who they want to rule over them? And then everyone, because it's all kings and queens and stuff, they also start laughing. It's a ridiculous concept. And that's what it was like, if you were to suggest such a concept during feudalism. Because how would it work? How would the serfs be able to make sensible decisions? They're illiterate. They're idiots. They haven't been chosen by God to be the rulers over mankind. We have. We're the feudal lords and kings. But then when people got access to education and the printing press, then actually they could make decisions, and there is a wisdom of the masses. And society could get much more stable if you have like a peaceful transition of power between democratically elected leaders. But equally, in the corporate setting or within private ownership over production, it's a gazillion times easier just to have a dictator, just to have a feudal lords and a king who direct it all, a decision maker. It makes, it's easier. I'm not necessarily sure it's more efficient if you look at the amount of failed ventures you have. Because, I can't remember the stats, but it's pretty huge. I think it's 90+% of all companies fail. And the capital's just lost and wasted. It's completely inefficient. But yeah, eventually you end up with a semi-decent decision maker who can then act as the king over the corporation. And actually, this is always interesting because a lot of people will say, well, workers have freedom of movement because they can just get their labor and then go somewhere else. So, you have a free market of labor. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, under Mussolini's Italy, people in Italy could get up and move and go somewhere else. But it didn't mean that Mussolini wasn't a dictator. He's still a dictator. It's just that people could move and go somewhere else if they wanted to. So, yeah.
Right, so let me take this back a few steps.
Probably a good idea. I tend to ramble on.
Right, because I want to ask you, how would cooperatives work differently from publicly traded companies? Because there seem to be a lot of similarities, and the goal seems to be that of success.
Yeah, exactly.
So is it about how you measure success? Because with companies, it's about profit, and with cooperatives, it can be something different?
Perhaps. I mean, you can still take the profit model as a way of measuring success. You could take it right back to Adam Smith, when he talked about the invisible hand in Wealth of Nations. What a lot of people don't understand is when Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand in Wealth of Nations, it was in direct reference to British merchants at that time, that they would have some obligation to British society. So they wouldn't export to their labor or their factories to cheaper countries where they could get things made cheaper, because they'd feel some responsibility as if guided by an invisible hand over the people of Britain. So profit as I don't know where I was going with that, but profit as that was it. Yeah. So there we go. So Adam Smith had this concept of the Vile Maxim. So it's the Vile Maxim of the masses of mankind, all for ourselves, nothing for other people. But then he believed that wouldn't happen because you would have some sense of responsibility. And I think that's probably that thing I was talking about before with small to medium sized enterprises, where you have a kind of sense of responsibility for the people who work for you and for your community and for where you're located. And you want all of those things to succeed alongside with you, and you want all those ships to raise up with you. And then I think it was probably like the Cold War game theory stuff, which was all about self, which then got applied to markets. The work of like John Nash with the prisoner dilemma, which then got applied to markets, which then made it actually being a good capitalist is pure pursuit of self above all else. And it's true to on paper, that's true, because you maximize profits above all else. And that's why you get that really heavy downward pressure on working rights, wages, and skills as well. Because one way to increase your profit is to de-skill your labor force. You don't have to pay them as much, and then they're more expendable. So they become more compliant because they know that, you can just sack them and get someone else in who's not really very skilled, because you have, a nice division of labor. So nobody's really skilled out of all the employees you're employing. Maybe that also goes back to the SME concept, that if you've got a smaller team, they're more likely to be higher skills. So you probably value them a little bit more anyway. That concept of self above all else, which was, curtailed by something of an invisible hand up until the Cold War stuff probably started to get applied to these corporations, the Cold War game theory. So maybe with a cooperative, you would then go back, you could have that sense of community, which you have with like a small to medium sized enterprise. You would have that invisible hand, more of that invisible hand, guiding your thoughts and decisions, knowing that you're part of something, and you're an important part of something. Your vote counts for something. You're not just working for a wage and doing what you're told, and there's not this constant downward pressure on your ability, on your skills. I think you do find as well. So if you look at, obviously the nature of labor has changed tremendously over the past 100 or so years. And we have things like agile, work methodology, where you empower people who are working in an environment to make their own decisions through something like a Scrum board, for example. People can choose their tasks and they can work on the tasks which they think are more important. They can collectively allocate time to each one of those tasks. So there is this kind of like collective ownership, responsibility thing, which has come into regular normal labor. And it is efficient. Like, it is more efficient because there's nothing worse than working for a job where you hate your job, you hate your boss. You're constantly being pushed to, for them to squeeze more productive time out of you to the point where it's inhumane, and you're working into the wee hours, it's having detrimental effect on your family, blah, blah, blah. Like, anyone who's worked in that kind of scenario, they'll appreciate that it's thoroughly miserable, and it's much nicer to kind of be a valued part of a team whose input is valued. So I think finally get to the point, which is that maybe in a cooperative you have a little bit more of that invisible hand guiding decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And as an incentive as well. So it wouldn't be purely profits. Because for purely profits, then you're probably best to go for the... I don't know, if you get rid of Jeff Bezos, to be fair, and then turned his value sucking into profit, then Amazon would be a lot more profitable. Without that leech taking value out from the top. So maybe, who knows, maybe a cooperative would be more profitable.
Right. So let me take this back to the issue of anarchism, because we have discussed the historic origins of anarchism, but we haven't really defined it in terms of what it is today. And a lot of people, when they hear about anarchy, they think about that circled A letter that people spray paint on walls.
Yeah, teenagers write on their maths book in school.
Exactly. And, all that sort of rebellion against any type of political system, and the idea that there should be no rules and it should all be chaos. And I suppose that's what most people think about when they hear about anarchy.
I think anarchism gave itself a bum rap. There was a big movement during the turn of the 20th century for anarchists to use violence and to kill people, as a way of... So if you look at Ferdinand, the guy, the assassination which kicked off the First World War, the anarchists killed him. The quote-unquote anarchists killed him. They were incredibly bad at killing people. They only killed people who didn't really necessary, and then it would then spiral out of control and create things like world wars. So they didn't get around to killing a Hitler or a Stalin or anything. But anyway, so the anarchists, for a period, they would resort to violence and assassination. So they were very easy for newspapers, for the press to propaganda against, state-owned press to propaganda against, draw caricatures of these crazy anarchists throwing grenades into buildings and etc. But anarchism itself, I think the most important anarchist for me is Mikhail Bakunin. He was so, I don't want your viewers to turn off, and please don't turn off. But I like a lot of the things which Marx said. I think they were accurate when it comes to capital and the exploitation of workers. But at that same time, while Marx was in the First International, which is like a labour movement in Europe, on the other side of the leftist movement, there was Mikhail Bakunin, and Mikhail Bakunin was saying, "Look, Marx, mate, you have all these, great expectations or these hopes for the proletariat dictatorship, which will take control over production and will, empower the workers of the world, everyone unite, blah, blah, blah. However, it will just lead to control and probably a worse form of control as to what currently we have as an alternative." And it did. Like, he predicted, what happened in the USSR. And that was very much from his... So Marx was he was a student of Adam Smith, but he was also a student of Hegel, and Hegel had he was quite fond of institutions and apparatus of state. He thought they were important for stability. And then inevitably within Marx's writings, that there is an element of that, which a lot of those, Marxist socialists like Lenin then try to use state, the apparatus of state, to then bring about socialism. And that's where a lot of that came from, a lot of that disaster came from. So Mikhail Bakunin was absolutely correct on that. But he's also a leftist, and but I mean, if you really want to know more about Anarchy, and he was a great writer too, and kind of the opposite of Marx. And Marx was quite insular guy, whereas Bakunin was like a party animal. Smoked tons of cigars, drank loads, didn't actually produce that much writing because he was just partying too much. So he's kind of a people's person, but he had a lot of respect for Marx. But yeah, as an anarchist, he just tried to shed light on any form of control, and any form of control has to justify itself. And if it can't justify itself, then it shouldn't exist. And actually, if you do that from almost any form of control, like it can't justify itself, and you can remove it. Sometimes it does, like a good example is, you cross the road, your child tries to run across the road in front of a car, and boom, you grab their arm, you stop them from doing that. There's a form of control there, isn't there? And you're taking someone's liberty away from them, but it's for a pretty good reason. Like, I think it's justifiable. But then a lot of forms of control can't be justified. So it goes back to the idea of anarchism, no masters, the literal sense of the literal meaning of the word, which is no masters, which I would then take into my, my little rant about private capital. I would say, well, with private capital, you still have a master. You have less of a master if you're working as a participant in a decentralized cooperative. So actually, a cooperative is far more anarchist than private capital, which is then why I would also attack anarcho-capitalism as a stupid idea, because you're supporting all these little dictatorships, whereas you really should be supporting. If you say you're an anarcho-free marketist, then fair enough. The free market can be overrun by things like cooperatives, but say you're a private anarcho-capitalist, that's stupid. Where was I going with that? Yeah, Mikhail Bakunin is well worth a read. He's got some cracking quotes, which I actually can't think of one off the top of my head now. I have to, but he's well worth listening to. And Audible Anarchist, actually, they do a great job of making audiobooks out of all of his books and papers.
Okay, let me tell you what I have spoken with Joshua Shigala from Voltoro when he was on the show in episode 3. So that will have been 3 episodes ago by the time I publish this. And he basically described anarchy as something which stems from the idea that you own yourself. You're not a slave. You are the master of your own body. And from this point on, he also took it to 2 basic first principles that in a society, regardless of the organization that it has, you should not steal and you should not do harm to others.
Sure. So I love the first principle argument because it's almost as if the assumption is that I'm arguing against those first principles, where I'm not. Obviously, don't kill, don't steal. It's obvious. But no masters also means you can't be a master over people. Of course. I mean, you having no masters doesn't then mean you can then go, master over people through private capital or through whatever else. So it then extends to that, which is why it was always a leftist tradition.
Voltoro, and that's VAULT, like a gold vault, and Oro, which is Spanish for gold, is a gold and Bitcoin exchange, which offers instant swaps between hard money to over 31,000 customers from more than 95 countries. Voltoro has offered Swiss privacy and security since 2015. Furthermore, the gold you purchase is your legal property, secured in your name, so even if something happens to Voltoro, even liquidators could not touch your gold. If you want to become the custodian of your own gold bars, you can request to have them delivered to you or simply trade them back to Bitcoin on the dip. Register for free in only 30 seconds and start trading only with hard money. Please keep in mind that all trading involves risks. This is not financial advice, and you are responsible for your own decisions. When you are using Wasabi Wallet, your internet connection gets routed through the Tor network by default. This means that you get better privacy while using Bitcoin. Download it today at wasabiwallet.io. Okay, so is there any way to mitigate this idea, to find the middle ground which makes it less relying on the socialist tradition?
Well, I mean, not really. I mean, so you just go for the free market thing. You know, you have free markets, and then put a lot of energy into making these cooperative things work, and then let them outcompete and monopolize the free market. I don't think, you know, it's a bit like the monopoly of encyclopedias, Wikipedia. You know, if Encyclopedia Britannica had the monopoly of not Wikipedias, of encyclopedias, then we would all think that was a bad thing. It's a privately run company, you know, selling Encyclopedia Britannica book collections to people. But, you know, we all appreciate that Wikipedia does a pretty good job. It's pretty decentralized, like pretty, you know, it's pretty open. And it's got a monopoly over encyclopedia, the market of its free market of encyclopedias, but it's okay. You know, no one's throwing up their arms. And it's also like, you know, think of server software. People aren't, if most of the world's websites ran on Microsoft servers, then people will be throwing up their arms saying this is a massive, you know, risk. It all being run on pieces of software owned by a private company, and they're not open, blah, blah, blah. But they're not. You know, most of the world's server software is run on free and open source solutions because they're decentralized and they're free and open stuff. You know, people can easily verify the code, and it's much more secure. And it's an area in which private capital hasn't been the solution. And although there is a monopoly, that monopoly is not a bad thing. So someone like an sort of an anarcho-capitalist. I don't really want to speak on Josh's ideology, but I imagine he thinks that if you have a free market of private capital, then that private capital will reach an equilibrium amongst themselves, and you'll end up with very efficient free markets where everyone benefits from it. You know, workers, the capitalists, everybody, and society gets better. I don't think that's true. I think if you have an actual free market of private capital, you'll just quickly end up with a monopoly. You'll have all the things you've got now. You'll have downward pressure on worker rights and on skills, and people will be de-skilled, demoralized, and eventually it will destroy itself. Which is why, you know, I think that Karl Marx was correct. That's something he wrote about, which is all the amazing things that capitalism has in it. You know, the ability to be able to produce things. It's phenomenal producing things. You know, and it connects the whole world in all these trade routes. Great, brilliant. However, it's got these contradictions which exist within that system producing things, and those contradictions will end up destroying itself. Will just end up destroying the capitalist mode of production, which I think is true. I think that's, you know, I think it would happen, and it is happening. If you look at, I mean, whether or not you agree to the environmental consequences of the way we produce things, you know, most of the world agrees that the environment, the climate, has been negatively affected by the amount of crap we produce and the amount of resources we consume. And there's one contradiction. You know, like, how can we carry on with this production method if it destroys the host planet where the things are being produced? Okay. The other one would be automation. So robots. When all the robots take their jobs and do everything, and human beings are pretty much redundant because we have to sleep and we sneeze and we make mistakes, whereas robots don't do that. You know, everything works perfectly. Then how are people going to afford to buy the products which society is producing if all the robots are making the things and no one's employed? How? Like, that's a contradiction. That's something which is going to make capitalism burn itself out. This is where Keynes came in, and then as well, actually, no, this is where Keynes came in. So the other contradiction would be the boom-bust cycle. So capital continues, it needs to expand. And if it's not expanding, it's collapsing in on itself. That's what we've seen. We haven't seen a sort of equilibrium be achieved. We see capital expand, and then we see it collapse in on itself, and then we see things like the Great Depressions, and we see wars and all those sorts of things. So Keynes, who was the treasurer during the First World War in the UK, he then came up with the concept of buffering out these economic crises, which are a result of just the capitalist mode of production, because it's inherently an unstable way of producing things, and buffering them out by recycling the surplus you get during the good times, during the boom years. You recycle that during the crash, during the down times, and then you buffer out those boom bust cycles to minimize the impact on human beings, and then also the aggregate demand, the aggregate, the obviously if all these companies which produce things and doing a wonderful job in a free market suddenly collapse in on themselves because you have a Great Depression, then and all these things need to be built up again from scratch. That's not particularly efficient. So, so it makes sense to kind of keep those things going during the down period, so we can continue to have aggregate demand then in the boom cycle. So so the anarcho-capitalist would argue that this, for some, I mean, this is the other thing which frustrates me. So you sort of say you're on the left, a lot of times you'll be accused of being a utopian, and it's like, I'm no utopian. I think there's lots of really challenging, complicated, possible scenarios and directions in which humanity will go. I just believe that to maximize human liberty, then we need to decentralize the mode of production. And I believe the best way to do that is through things like cooperatives and joint action. Whereas, the anarcho-capitalists, they'll say, well, no, we have found the answer, the panacea. All we need is more of this capitalism stuff. It's perfect, doesn't do anything, doesn't have any effect on the negative effect on the environment, won't burn itself out by, over becoming too efficient in itself, so creating robots, won't destroy itself through some crazy boom bust cycle. It's the perfect system which will harmoniously reach this equilibrium stage where everyone will get richer. That's utopian. It's crazy to think that we could just continue with that form of producing. And humans have produced things in loads of different ways. We produce things through monarchy, we produce things through feudalism, we produce, we're now producing things through sort of capital markets. And to think that humanity won't evolve into something else, and the way we produce things won't change over time, given all the challenges which we've got coming our way, and for capital markets, is crazy. That is utopian. But this is, I think that Bitcoin will obviously have a big impact on all this, and this is very much why I like Bitcoin, is and just free and open source, in fact, free and open source software, because it gives a model for decentralized consensus. Like, how this is the hardest thing for a decentralized system to do, is just make decisions. You haven't got that dictator, you haven't got that decision maker. We got rid of Gavin Dreesen, didn't we? Because he fancied himself as something, a decision maker, because we understand that it's more decentralized if we have a consensus protocol. And if the most amount of people who are using that system are able to contribute to that system in a meaningful way, it's good for humans. And in fact, Marx would summarize communism as each to his own ability, each to his own need. Which free and open source software, you can use it however you want, and then contribute where you can, where in which you can. So yeah, but that's where I would argue. I would say that concept of free markets and private capital just magically fixing the world is utopian. And actually, I would also say that, when you have a monopoly of these big players, then they're very much likely to create state and state control anyway, because it benefits them and increases their monopoly position. So actually, when you get to a certain level of capitalism, it's actually good capitalism to create, rig the game so you can have more of a monopoly, and you can do that through government, through neoliberal sort of control mechanisms, which we see. And you can take that way back to the East India Company, the first major company corporation the world has ever seen. Within a few years, had to have huge bailouts because of some bad investment decisions, just like we saw in the 2008 crisis, and similar amounts of money as well. What would equate to now billions, tens of billions, to bail out the East India Company. So it was within their interest then to increase the power of states, so they can, although they'll kick and scream and say, oh no, we want free markets, we don't want control, and then they then have this thing which they can lobby and use to assert more control and monopoly. But anyway, so yeah, I don't subscribe to that. I think it's utopian that free markets will just reach an equilibrium and balance themselves out.
Yeah, but at the same time, you don't find yourself in the situation where you argue for more state intervention, as far as I understand. You are for
It
decentralization.
I am, but then I'm kind of a pragmatist in a way, and that this is the road to serfdom, isn't it? Is I do think that when it comes to some things like healthcare, for example, um, uh, national health services seem to do a very good job. Public health services seem to do a good job. It seems to be better than private health services. If you look at all the top health services around the world, in all the countries who are most successful with the health service, they're all, the majority of them, publicly owned. Even Switzerland, I think it's like 70% publicly owned and then 30% privately owned. Or you have some sort of like public health insurance system, maybe, and the Germans have that, and that's pretty good. That kind of works. So, yes, ideally, if I am putting my utopian hat on, then, I mean, in fact, there's this. Go back to Marx again. There's this great concept by Marx and Engels, which is the withering of state, which is when socialism's achieved, that the state will no longer need to exist; it will just wither away and die. And it's the idea that when you remove all the functions of states through some, cooperatives, through like monetary control, for example. Say if you have a Bitcoin and you don't no longer need like a treasury department, like there we are, you're disempowering, so you're kneecapping state in quite a significant way there. Suddenly you'll find yourself in a position where, do we actually need state to organize this stuff for us, or can it? Is it organizing itself? Or is this road DAO employing people to fix the roads and keep our road infrastructure working effectively? Employing participants or engaging participants to join the road cooperative DAO movement. I don't know. It's just an example. Then the powers of state and the uses and the necessity of state would wither away and die. I think that would happen. I think for now, though, I'm happier for healthcare to be run by. It still does a terrible job. I'm not saying it does a great job. It's still buggy as hell. It's just less of a terrible job and less buggy than private capital doing it. Education, access to education as well. In fact, give schools more money to be able to run properly. The biggest problem with schools is they just and this is, in fact, a lot of public sector is they have just less and less money to work with, and they what else? Police, so security. I don't want private security firms, like a free market of private security firms you pay for, because what places in the world where their security relies on private security firms, it's very expensive, very inefficient, and you end up with loads of human rights abuses. So what else? There's a whole bunch of things, roads. There's a whole bunch of things which I appreciate about a civilized society, which are taken care of by the whole of that society through this current mechanism of state. That could be improved. It could be what would you call them? Sort of like they would have more sort of self-management and autonomy, and it would be less top-down. But again, that could be that sort of management structure which comes from private capital has made its way into the public sector. Or maybe not, but whatever. I would like that to be decentralized as well. And then, you slowly remove the need for state. But I'm not saying that currently in our current society, it's not quite nice to have those things provided, for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you to the fullest extent. For example, in your case about police and security, I can only think that the police only acts after something had happened. So they don't act to protect you, they act to intervene when something terrible happens. And they only protect when it happens under their watch. But that's very relative. When you're paying for a private company, if you can afford it, they at least preemptively act against some sort of attack that you fear that might happen.
Well, there'd be like cost-saving mechanisms. So rather than have to deploy resources to prevent something from happening, they'll try and They'll try and address the cause rather than treating the symptoms sort of thing. So what are you saying?
Something along the lines, yes. And I was trying to give a very simple example so I don't leave too much ambiguity along there. But I was also thinking that in my country, we have this system of social security and also medical services that's subsidized by our taxes. I pay 10% of my income to the health service, the equivalent of the NHS from the UK. But it's very inefficient, and not only that, but most of the times when you go to a state hospital, they don't really ask for money extra, but they don't refuse gifts. And if somebody gives the doctor a gift, then the doctor is incentivized to pay more attention to that patient.
Well, that could be this, but that could.
That,
I mean,
that
that's
happens
just
at the expense of everyone else who cannot afford to have that sort of special treatment.
That's just corruption, and that could also happen in a private model too. It's just, I mean, we don't have that. You know,
but in a private environment, you can opt out. You can say, I'm not going to give you any more money because you're corrupt, and I'm going to the guy next door who's doing the same service.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think your public sector done badly isn't an excuse to just wipe public sector away. Often it's particularly when it comes to things like corruption. Like, there's lots of countries where there is corruption, and a lot of that happens in public sector, but a lot of it also happens in private sector as well. Like, you know, you can grease private companies to get you to the top of the queue.
I mean, yeah, but what kind of system are we speaking about? Because if it's crony capitalism, I can agree that some corporations are actually extensions of the state, and they're not really private companies since they receive so much help and so many subsidies and tax cuts and stuff like that. But if we speak about a truly free market, I mean, if there's some sort of corruption and there's a large degree of corruption within a private company, then it comes at the expense of their own investors and shareholders and whatever. So they have to afford to subsidize that corruption. While at the same time, the state can afford to make as many mistakes as they can because there's going to be a worker who's going to pay for it. So the politicians can experiment with any type of decision making and make all of the worst decisions possible, because at the end of the day, there's going to be some debt that's going to get paid across 50 years maybe. And it's not them who pays for it. So there's no incentive.
No, I agree completely. I said this at the beginning, like, it's still an incredibly buggy system. I just prefer it than being in the hands of private capital. But I worked for public sector. You know, I was a teacher, and the amount our service cost and the amount of inefficiencies which you would see just on a daily basis, which just wouldn't exist in private sector. You know, like, so in our office, for example, we had this ginormous 1970s photocopier, which didn't work. Or 1980s, 90s, a huge thing. And it just didn't work. And it just took up, like, you know, most of the office. This thing's huge. Anyway, like, we were paying a maintenance charge on that machine, and it was like £100 a month or something. It hadn't worked clearly for a decade, but nobody was incentivized to make that cost saving within, you know, and it made me think, well, how many more of these photocopiers are out there? How leaky is this ship? It's so leaky. But even though in saying all that, I still would prefer for access to education be something which society dealt with as a whole, as opposed to private companies dealing with it. I don't know. Maybe there's some sort of, you know, balance between the two, maybe. But
I can argue that after this long history of taxation, if we were to move to a different system, people would understand the benefits of having all children go to school and the benefits of having a healthcare system which takes care of everyone and nobody really gets left behind. And let's not forget that nation states have existed since the 19th century, most of them. Before that, you had city states and you had the feudal system. We also had empires before that, and they scaled very poorly. So we arrived to this type of organizing nations and nation states, which united different regions that were speaking a similar or the same language. And the centralization around them is something that happened progressively. I can tell you 100% certainly that my grandfather, if he was asked to give 10% of his production to the state, he would just take his pitchfork and light a torch and go and protest and maybe crack some skulls until he got what he wanted, which was lower taxes. But in our situation, we pay about 50% of what we make, and that's only direct taxes, because you also have VAT and you also have all sorts of consumption taxes and green taxes and parking taxes, and pretty much everything gets taxed to the extent that I don't think much of the money that you're making still belongs to you or your production.
Let me get back to my point. Like, I'm happy with, in my current society in Wales, UK, I'm happy for those things to be provided for by, the country as a whole through state apparatus and democratic elections. However, I don't think it's the answer, and I think it's buggy, and I think there's much better solutions, such as, and I think that there's a much better future where none of us pay tax, where we're all participants in all the things we do, whether we're working for, community-based commons management, or whether we're working for cooperatives. I think when we're able to seamlessly move, there'll be freedom of movement between participants into these different organizations. I think that's the future which I want. But I'm just saying, at this current point in time, I wouldn't want all of our security and police to be done by the private sector, nor would I want it to be done for the same for healthcare and the same for education. But I'm not saying they're not incredibly buggy, terrible systems. They are. And from this point, that's where I would hope to move towards decentralizing them and removing the masters and making them more efficient. And I think software is going to be a huge part in that. So I don't want to sort of fall into that trap of me arguing for taxes and you arguing against taxes, because that's it's like a temporary band-aid currently, but it's something which should be eroded away. The need for should be eroded away over time.
Hey, psst, hey, what's your plan for the next Bitcoin top? Unless you need the money to purchase something, you probably should not touch infinitely inflationary fiat. Check out Vaultoro and figure out to which extent hard money like gold and silver can help you preserve your purchasing power. You will be able to get back into Bitcoin as soon as the price hits a new bottom, and you will not be subjected to the arbitrary inflation-driven volatility of fiat or fiat-backed coins. Obviously, this is not financial advice, and you should understand that all trading involves risks. Wasabi Wallet connects to your full Bitcoin node, and if you're not running one, it downloads block filters anonymously via Tor. In either case, you're getting excellent privacy. Download the software today at wasabiwallet.io. Sometimes I get very angry because, especially around the tax month, which is May in my country, and I get very angry because I realize how much I'm paying, and I pay my taxes as a freelancer. I pay my taxes every year on a certain month. So I don't pay them after every paycheck like the rest of the people who are employed, for example, because the state has created a way in which the tax amounts get deducted from the salary, and they don't have to think about how much gets taken away from them. But I actually get to see that money. It's on the table. I watch it. I can touch it. I can smell it, and I can realize, okay, how much of this is going to education? That's what I ask myself. And I realize that it's not much, about 3% of that. How much is going to healthcare? Well, 10%, but is it really going to be the local hospital? So is this really going to improve the quality of the healthcare that I will be receiving if I go to the local hospital? And the answer is most likely no, because the state is going to use the money however it thinks is best. And I would be a lot happier, and this is the point to which I was trying to get, if I were able to distribute some of the money or most of it to a hospital or to a school from my neighborhood, and I was able to see the returns in a more tangible way. Because this is, and I'm going to use a term that is also from Karl Marx, it's alienating to not see the result, to know that you're contributing to something for which you're never really seeing any results, and it's only some sort of government chart which you can trust or you can distrust. It's your choice. But at the end
Well,
of the day, you see that your life doesn't really change much.
well, particularly if you're in a country as well where there's an element of corruption, you know that a large portion of those taxes are going to go into the back pockets of corrupt officials. And then, we're famous for our bureaucracy here. So more than 50% of our taxes will just go to crazy backward bureaucracy, and making positions for roles which justify themselves, and they needn't exist in a much more efficient model. So then we say, well, what would a future look like? Okay, so if you were to, there's a few possible futures which would make your life probably less traumatic, and that would be, if we were using something like Bitcoin, for example, something which could be transparent for public sector and then private for people, then we could instantly see where funds were going. We could just have read keys or public keys, or the read macaroon or whatever for different government departments and wallets, and then suddenly when the general public can account for where money's going and where it's being spent efficiently or not efficiently, then they can then start lobbying to say, well, why is this department getting X amount when it doesn't seem to produce anything? It just seems to produce lots of highly paid white collar workers. So that's one possible future scenario. The other possible future scenario would be that you do free market some of these things out. But by free market some of these things out in a way, so not the free market of private capital, but a free market of cooperatives. If I am correct, and better software, better sort of access to consensus making tools leads to more realistic cooperatives, then those cooperatives could then, go for tenders, for private tenders for different public services, and then it's still being run by a local community. I mean, in many ways, sort of a more federated model like that. That's personally where I would kind of hope for things to go towards. There's a great book by Rudolf Rocker called, what's it called? It's the Spanish Revolution, and bloody hell, anarcho-syndicalism, which is, there's some anarcho-syndicalism which is called democratic confederalism, which is happening in Rojava at the moment in northern Syria, and that's been quite successful at allocating very minimal resources to keep society moving, to keep the roads paved and all that sort of stuff, and that I would like things to go in that direction, where these roles of government would be taken by cooperatives, which are then winning these tenders because they're more efficient than private capital, which is coming. But in order to get there, you need the cooperatives to be better. But until we can get to that point where those cooperatives are better, like I wouldn't want my security services, my police force, to be privately owned as a corporation by Google, for example. I don't want them to fucking run the police. it'd be horrible. So currently, maybe if I was in a more corrupt kind of country, then I'd be more open to that idea. But there's a bunch of ways in which we can fix the issues you have. One is making tax expenditure much more transparent and then also accountable, which no country has currently, I suppose. And then, and a lot of that just comes from eroding the powers of state, which you do by empowering people. And then the other possible future would be where these states, the state apparatus stuff, which strengthens state, becomes controlled, like federated, broken up into smaller kind of cooperatives, clusters of people and participants reaching consensus. Here's the amount of money we've got. Like, how are we going to fix these roads in this local area, I suppose.
My biggest hope for Bitcoin is that at some point, if it becomes a national currency of sorts and it's not used in a custodial way, so you run your own node and you get to choose what you do with your own coins, and you also benefit from the protection of the police force, so nobody with a gun comes to your door saying hand over your keys to the state. So under these conditions, my hope is that one day we'll be able to say, no, I disagree with the way in which you govern. I don't think that you're governing in a good way. And unless you comply with my expectations and do something that's useful for me, then I'm not going to pay you taxes. And if I'm not going to pay you taxes, you're not going to have the budget that you want. So that means that your government is going to be a lot less efficient because you don't benefit from these resources. And of course, there will be no moment when everyone pays their taxes fairly, and there's always going to be someone who rebels. But at the same time, you're going to have much more accountability, and those in government are going to feel much more responsible for their decisions and for the ways in which they manage their taxpayers' money. Because the current system feels like a waste in many ways. You mentioned yourself that you have all of these white-collar workers who serve no purpose other than just raising employment rates so that it looks good. And they only sign a paper or something like that. They're just their jobs are created for the simple reason that there should be jobs, and they're afraid of becoming obsolete, and they're increasing the state apparatus. And moreover, you also run into situations where the state extends itself indefinitely, because let's say that instead of acknowledging incompetence or corruption, it just establishes a further body that's going to inspect the activity of the previous body, and it can run into this loop where it creates a new body to watch over the other one until, I don't know, some sort of revolution takes place. Because usually these temporary solutions don't really turn out to be temporary. And for the sake of keeping employment rates up, they're not going to dial down on any of these decisions. And whenever a politician comes around and says, if you elect me, I'm going to cut the percentage of state workers by 50% or something like that. I think there was a French presidential candidate who said that and turned out to be very unpopular, and obviously he lost. Because when you employ so many people under the state apparatus, you destroy the incentives for people to actually think critically and consider that this is too much and this is inefficient because their living depends on it. It's a rigged system.
You do. So, yeah, true. Very true. All that's very true. However, quite often public sector isn't subject to the same, I mean, all the things which make it inefficient, I suppose, but it's not subject to the same downward pressure on skills and worker rights as you get in private sector. So quite often public sector people are paid quite well, and that then affords them, like, the ability to be able to study and go to university, send their kids to university. And so, in countries where you have a larger public sector, you do end up with this, you do end up with, quite an educated, and then you do end up with kind of a lot of people who have access to decent. Look at somewhere like Denmark or Sweden or something, where they have quite a large public sector. Their society doesn't seem worse off for it. I mean, it's not a corrupted society. It's a kind of an efficient kind of public sector. But again, I don't want to argue for public sector. So if we go back to anarchism, and before when you said, well, what would anarchism be for you? I didn't say what I should have said, which is it's democracy from the ground up as opposed to democracy from the top down. And that just means that there is loads of organization. It's not just the individual. It's not just chaos. Like, it's not just people doing whatever they want and, trying to increase their own bags. It's people working together, but from the ground up. So I'm involved in a sort of local anarchist community near where I live. We got a house there, which we built. And there's no state intervention. We have our own road, which we've built, and then we have our own services, public sort of services, which we maintain. And we have to meet, and we have to say, well, if we want a new sign telling cars to slow down, then when they come down our road, we have to all meet together. And then, well, who's going to make the sign? Who's going to put the sign in the ground? We have to. And what I find there, as opposed, because I also live in just my actual house where I live is a rented house in sort of a normal suburban scenario. What I find where I am in my suburban scenario, people are friendly enough to each other, but there's not really a sense of community in the same way which is there's in that other place. Because in that other place, for example, there's no boundaries, land boundaries, for example, are fuzzy. It's like a hedge which has moved because someone at some point has kind of pushed the hedge back a bit to try and gain a little bit more ground over their neighbor. So that there's all these potential areas where you could end up with a real conflict between people, but they have to work out and they have to be amicable. And then you can't just sort of throw your weight around being an asshole, because you're relying upon those other people and that's, to me, that's kind of anarchism. It's by having democracy from the ground up, by having organization from the ground up, as opposed to having it from the top down. It plays to all of humanity's strengths, to communities, to working together, to mutual aid, that's arguably the best definition for anarchism.
Yeah, right. But I can also argue that you don't really have a sense of community in the place where you rent your house, because there are not many landlords living in the houses around your community.
No. We're the only people who rent. Everyone else owns their houses. That's not true. They're all private. But a lot of the things, the things human beings would have to do in a community, and a lot of the decisions which would have to be made are made by the larger state thing, aren't they? So there's clear boundary lines of their property, and there's the people who come and do the road, there's people who come and do this, and there's people who come and do that. So there's less reason for people to have to meet with each other, and there's more reason for people to be in their own little isolated bubble, alienated bubble, where they don't have to. And I think probably the old and infirm, they suffer the most. Like in our little anarchist community, the old people there, they're very engaged with the community. And everyone kind of feels responsibility for them almost. We want to look at, well, if we go in the shops and stuff, we'll say, oh, do you want something from the shop, blah, blah, blah. And then whereas in our more suburban context, you try and be kind of community minded, but it's harder to do because, I don't know, you're just not kind of rubbing shoulders as much as you would be in that less controlled environment. And that's the state stuff, which I'm not into that. Those results that you get from having state manage everything in the erodes kind of these community bonds. But this doesn't mean that I think the answer is to just get rid of community. I think you want more community, but you need it from kind of ground up.
I mean, I never said that the purpose is to give up on community, only to have more private ownership so that there is greater skin in the game, and it's in your best interest to care about what goes around you, because when you rent a place, you know that it's likely that you will not be dying in that place. It's
that's
not
just
your
listen.
property.
That's just us. That's not the reason people in this context. We haven't got a WhatsApp group for my street or my neighborhood, whereas we have for that other community. We have got a WhatsApp group. It's a very busy WhatsApp group. We're all kind of chatting away with each other over little things which need to be fixed, bushes which need to be cut back, that sort of stuff. So we're much more organised in the other community, and there's much more bond between people. But it's not just because it's not the reason. Isn't because that we don't own the house. We're renting the house we're living in. That's not the reason. It's a human societal thing. They're two different, living environments. One where people have to get along with each other and work with each other to get stuff done, and then the other where stuff is kind of taken care stuff is kind of done for them. And they are more adversarial actually in the sort of environment, the suburban environment. And you talk about self-interest, but like, what are the ideals you're actually promoting there? In order for you to be the most rational player in a game of self-interest, you have to actively be adversarial to the other players. That's where the Cold War game theory stuff comes in for irrational players in a market, which actually just doesn't work. This is what breaks the model, because people don't do that. People, do irrational things, like they want to trust each other and work with each other, as opposed to just trying to one-up each other to be rational players in a game. But no, that's not the reason. The reason is it's a completely different living environment. Why the two communities exist differently.
Golden Bitcoin, 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 golden Bitcoin. Voltoro, Voltoro, Wasabi Wallet's innovative coin joins will make your bitcoins more fungible. So if you accumulate more than 0.1 BTC, you can mix it with other users to remove all traces about their whereabouts. So it's like putting multiple fingerprints on your dollar bills, and it becomes impossible to determine the last few owners of the money. Download Wasabi Wallet today and start coin joining. Okay, let me change the topic a bit, and by a bit I mean quite a lot, because since we last spoke, we have had this event which happened in Bitcoin history, and it's not to be overlooked because it seems to be major and it seems to change the dynamic and the definition of what Bitcoin is and how it's going to be regarded from now on. And it's the fact that we have seen in El Salvador how they voted to make Bitcoin legal tender. So it's going to be the second official currency after the US dollar, which is their first fiat currency, official fiat currency. And now we're going to also have Bitcoin that's going to be used there. And I was among the people who are very critical about it and mentioned that we don't really need this. And I often find people on Twitter who are in favor of it and say that this liberates people. I don't believe that anyone should be forced to be free, and this should be a consequence of one's personal will and understanding of the world. And I don't think that this is going to make anyone freer, because so I guess this comes back to the example that you presented earlier with the two Amazons. But if people have to choose between a non-custodial wallet, which makes you pay fees and makes you run a node and makes you run extra stuff in the background, or a custodial wallet that's endorsed by the government, has the greatest amount of exposure because it's endorsed by the government and eliminates some inconveniences that may come from their lack of technical understanding, then we're going to end up with Bitcoins getting traded on some sort of balance sheet, even if it's on Lightning. And it's not permissionless, it's not really decentralized, it's not really private. You don't benefit from any of the advantages that you have from running your own node. It's just that you might be using the kind of currency which appreciates against the dollar or against some other fiat currency in time, which I guess can be helpful, but I'm still very skeptical that this can work well. And I'm afraid that if this turns out to be a terrible experiment, it's gonna be bad for Bitcoin as a project, because it's gonna have a bad reputation and it's always going to be associated with that. It's gonna be like a second Silk Road moment from where we have to basically distance ourselves from that failed experiment. And not only that, but it's gonna cause a lot of unnecessary suffering for people who may deal with Bitcoin thinking that it's private and stuff like that. There are lots of misconceptions about what Bitcoin is and what it does. And unless we have proper education in the field and people understand what they're doing and what they're using and what the limitations are, there's gonna be a lot of suffering. At least that's my understanding. And I spoke too much already. I'm gonna let you express your opinion on it.
To be honest, hats off to you for sticking with your, because I was amazed how many diehard, ideologically opposed to state people in Twitter were like, "Yay, El Salvador government, make it legal tender. It's great." I think, it's good. It's good for you to be skeptical, and I do agree that it would certainly dent the Bitcoin adoption if El Salvador turned out to be a horrendous disaster. Just like other examples throughout Bitcoin's history have dented its evolution, but it hasn't stopped it because obviously the technology is amazing. However, I'm a bit more positive than you. I think that you're teaching people in your society a tool of liberation and a freedom, which will and disempowering yourself as a potential sovereign currency producer. You're giving everyone in that society a way to use something else other than the US dollar, which is a good thing because the colonial imperialist impact which the US has had on Central America has been atrocious over the past 100 years. So unempowering them is super important. You're providing an actual useful service, like resource for people, because you have remittance. So is it 70% of El Salvador's GDP is remittance payments from US to El Salvador, of which 3 or 4, 5% gets taken by Western Union and the like. That's atrocious. That's an actual percentage of their GDP being taken for offering just a value transfer service, which is crazy. And then it's insanely efficient. We got all that amazing social scalability. So if you look at, there's that great Vice documentary, I don't know if anyone's seen it, and in it there's a guy who pays his electricity bill, and I had to pay an electricity bill recently and it came in the post. I had to phone a number, pay a thing. Oh no, it wasn't an electricity bill, it was a parking fine. I got a parking fine, and I had a letter came in the post. Had to phone this clunky public sector automated call center thing, which took ages, was annoying, kept pressing the wrong buttons. In the Vice video, the guy gets his electric bill, it's a QR code, takes out his Bitcoin wallet, scans it, pays it. Now, he was using, I think, is it the Gallo wallet thing? He was using, which is the government, is the government sponsored one? I think it's the government, not sponsored, but the government, endorsed one. He was using that wallet, but his Bitcoin, he could have used any wallet to pay that. That's massively more efficient than what I experienced in a fully developed nation. So you have all that social scalability. So they don't need to set up all these call centers, all these sort of public sector services in order for them to have these payment services and have their people who live there have access to these payment services. And the guy in the video was saying that it saved him like 3 hours doing that. Because he was unbanked, he would have to get on a bus for an hour and then go wait somewhere for an hour, give someone a wedge of cash, and then get back on the bus, and then that would take 3 hours the whole trip to pay an electricity bill. Whereas you could do it in like seconds just off his phone. So we're going back to that concept of banking the unbanked. A lot of people in El Salvador are unbanked. And the concept that you could potentially have some value being transferred from the US, which then is instantly usable by people in El Salvador. So, you suddenly have some sort of family crisis, or your gran needs to pay a phone bill. I don't know. Someone needs to pay something, and you can send that money over Bitcoin, over Lightning, and then, they get it instantly. Speed of light. They have access to it. They could use it, and they can spend it on their public services, or they could spend it locally. I do think for everyday medium of exchange, it's not the most useful thing because of the crazy price fluctuations. Some people argue that will dampen over time. I'm not sure they will, the crazy Bitcoin price fluctuations. I don't think there's any real concrete data to say they will. Obviously, as liquidity gets bigger, then I suppose it'll impact price fluctuation. But currently, whatever, it's all over the place. Price can halve in a week, or double in a week. And you don't really want that for a bunch of poor people who are using their capital in very innovative ways to try and create more capital. You want something which is stable. So I do think we need, what I would like to see personally in El Salvador is for them to produce their own currency, which was based as a side chain off Bitcoin, using something kind of like a liquid token, like a federated model. So each, I don't know, geographically, each kind of county or region would have the ability to sign to produce more or less of this token, and then collectively they could reach consensus over the amount of new El Salvador dollars which are minted. So what you would have is a kind of you'd have the world's most advanced soft currency and least corruptible soft currency, because in order to corrupt it, you would have to have all of these geographical regions working in collaboration. And it would also become something which I think would become pretty stable, and the larger world markets would use. So I think, what I'm getting at is, I think that would be better for them for everyday medium of exchange, like a Bitcoin sidechain thing, like maybe even a drive chain if we eventually get that thing running, where it's an El Salvador soft currency which could be federated in the way in which it's managed. But what I'm getting at is that social scalability again. You're taking a country with very limited infrastructure, you're giving it the world's, and you're empowering it and teaching it about the world's most advanced monetary value transfer system, and collection of tools as well, like toolkit. And then from that, they're going to be able to produce a whole lot of useful, functioning, pieces of software for helping their country and helping their markets. So I think Blockstream, they're doing a bond. They want to produce some sort of bond by the government, which would operate like 24 hours as opposed to like a conventional bond. I don't know. I saw a quick snip on Twitter. I saw a tweet by them. I thought that looked very promising. So there's all this social scalability which comes with it. It's empowering for the individual because you're teaching them tools of liberation. It's useful in that they can use it for remittance. It's socially helps a whole load of social scalability in building out better financial infrastructure and banking all of those unbanked people. And most importantly, the point which I haven't even touched upon really, is that it disempowers the US. It takes away their power over the region in a way which is hard to sanction against and to sanction against by the US. One of the major properties of Bitcoin, which no one really discusses, is it's apolitical. No country controls it, runs it, has power over it. It's an apolitical form of money, form of medium of exchange. And that's incredibly powerful when it comes to loosening the grip of the world currency producer, the world reserve currency producer, the US. And the South America during the 60s and 70s, well, I'll go back further, I'll go to the sort of late 40s, mid 40s, in fact, mid 40s to 70s, they attempted a huge amount of coups, and they were successful in a huge amount of coups, combating the specter of quote unquote socialism, communism in South America. In actual fact, a lot of those countries were just voting in a socially democratic government, which wanted to, curtail some of the abuses from private capital, the oil producers or the United Fruit Company or whoever else from the US, all these United States companies, and then the United States to protect their investment and to allow their companies, to give their companies free access to those cheap resources. We're going back to, as we were talking about before, give access to those cheap resources. They would have coups and often install horrible military dictatorships, which takes a country a long time to resolve and get over. yeah, I think it's overall a good thing off the back of all that. But I very much admire you sticking to your, to what you believe. I think more people should have done it rather than just like instantly embrace it without a kind of skeptical, objective viewpoint. Just because Jack Malice has endorsed Bekele, suddenly everyone would overlook his, some of the more fishy operations of his government and just think this is an absolutely outstanding thing. Without sort of questioning why it might be a good thing or why it might in fact be a bad thing, and also the effect it could have on Bitcoin if it's done poorly. But no, I'm very positive about it.
I've always considered that Bitcoin adoption should happen as an organic phenomenon, peer-to-peer. You educate somebody, you explain to them why they should do this, they understand why they need it, and that's why they start running a node and they start contributing to the network. Or if they don't want to, that's fine, but they should at least run their own node and use free open source software, which empowers them to the greatest extent.
Yeah, you're right.
If you run into this situation where you use something just because your elected politician tells you to and has enacted a law which creates a framework for this to become a currency, and all of a sudden people will start, installing wallets on their phones and doing stuff just because it's part of the new establishment. Well, I don't think this is going to last too much if it's an obligation, but we shall see. I also regard Latin America as a test bed for lots of political experiments. And if you look in the 20th century and in their recent history, they have had lots of situations with military dictatorships, with communist regimes, with far-right regimes. You get like a mix of everything. And if you look at the history of El Salvador specifically, you're going to see that the average presidency doesn't last longer than 4 years. So after one term, most politicians are gone.
Colonialism creates instability. So the reason you have like far left political parties gaining control is because at some point there was some moderate left political party which was, murdered or imprisoned or exiled. Yeah, but and then the US helped install some far right dictator. So you're pushing that pendulum, hard in the direction of a far right dictator, and then it swings it back to a far left dictator, which is just as worse.
You're just pointing out to the cause of it, and that's not the point. The point is that the population is used to change, and they have a culture. They have nurtured a culture where there's constant change. And if you look at the party of the current president from El Salvador, its name can be translated as New Ideas, and that tells us everything about their culture. Whenever they deem something interesting, they're going to vote it into office, see how it goes, and then most likely they vote it out. So if the Bitcoin experiment doesn't go well, it's likely that they're not going to vote for anyone who endorses this currency, and that's going to be that's going to give a bad reputation to Bitcoin, and we're gonna be the laughing stock of academic economists and stuff like that just because that experiment has failed. And in my estimation, I think it's most likely to fail.
I don't know. I mean, I think the Austrians weren't the laughing stock of Chile when they fucked that one up, when Hayek went in there and screwed that economy, ended up with a larger public sector.
Yeah, but let's not get to history before Bitcoin in this case, because we're talking about a 12-year-old project, which all of a sudden starts getting this adoption from above, of which I'm not a big fan, and I'm not going to advocate for it. I might applaud the efforts of those who try to educate on the ground, because I think that's how adoption should happen. But just because you have a beach where people started accepting Bitcoin as a currency doesn't mean that you should scale it to the entire nation just because you turn out to be friends with the president and you think it's a good idea, and you're gonna deal with stronger and more influential adversaries than the usual armchair economists who are going on whatever news channel you're watching telling you why Bitcoin doesn't work. Now we're going to have to deal with national security advisors and war generals and all of the fear mongerers who usually have a greater credibility than the average academic.
I agree with all of that, but then I will also say that all the stuff I said before is still relevant. That all the great things which will come from it. But yeah, I agree that it's far better if people just adopt this thing organically by themselves. But if you live in a sovereign state, you have legal tender laws. I can't go spending US dollars. If I do, I'll get in trouble. If I was a shop and I started accepting US dollars here in the UK, I'd get in trouble because the British pound has the money monopoly over this region, for better or for worse. If the government were, said that now there's this other option which people need to facilitate, shops need to provide support for, which is, it now accepts Bitcoin, I'd probably be in favor of that as a citizen. So I everything you said is true. It's far better if it's organically found and people opt for it off their own backs, and we don't need state and politicians, whoever else, to say yes, this is now something you can use. But I think a lot of good will come from it, and I think it'd be quite hard for it to quote unquote fail. They could have like an unpleasant experience if they put too many of their eggs in one basket. I think also this is why I don't like the idea of using it for day-to-day transactions. Like I like the idea of people having exposure to it, but I'm not sure arguing that a shop has to, list all their products in Bitcoin value is a particularly good idea. It just sounds like a lot of work. You're going to have to run around changing the prices every 3 seconds for your products in your shop. But you do get access to this. You're teaching your whole country how to use this incredibly powerful, socially scalable toolkit. And then you are also, because they're the first ones to really embrace Bitcoin as a country, then you are also opening the door to a lot of investment, which that country needs. And there'll be a whole fintech, there'll be a whole movement of fintech companies going there to try and build services. It's the new frontier, the new gold rush. And as well as that, the Bekele government, they can phone up anyone, phone up Adam Back, phone up all these genies, Greg Maxwell, whoever you want to phone them up. And you'll have them at the end of the phone, and they'll be able to advise you on how to build some new financial tool. So you get a lot of free consultancy, which would cost the government a hell of a lot of money. I think there's lots of good which comes from it, but I do agree that, yeah, absolutely, ideally, ideologically, people find it on their own and they just use it organically. But I think if most people do that in most countries, they start to get in trouble for accepting something which isn't acknowledged as legal tender. We do live in a real world, and it would be hard for it to fail. At the very worst, it would make a small dent in Bitcoin's evolution, but acceptance and adoption. But I think that a lot of good is going to come from it.
I sure hope so, because if they use custodial services and they don't really get education about how this is supposed to work, then I don't see much value in this effort.
Well, that's another good example. So all the useful things I've made personally have been from having something out in the wild, actually running it in a real world context. All the ridiculous, unuseful things I've made has been me sat there waiting for divine inspiration and then overthinking something and thinking, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be a revolution for blah, blah, blah. Actually, like running software and testing it is the most important thing. And now one of the main things we've butt up against straight away, which is where, Strike are trying to work on a solution, is the fees, is how much it costs to send a Bitcoin transaction. Well, then, a whole lot of people now are trying to work out how to bring that down. Because if you have this level of adoption and you have these people who haven't got huge resources, they're not some billionaire who can pay like an astronomical fee to transfer some Bitcoin, but what solutions are available? And then maybe this will, push for technology which helps Bitcoin become more accessible and inclusive, BIPs and the like, to be adopted quicker, so people on the ground can actually use it. So, just as a it's like, when I had Bitcoin stuff running in room 77 in Berlin, it was great. Like when I had my little point of sale working there in the bar and people were using it, and like a large amount of people were using it, was great. And then, we got the feedback that we needed to be able to like create a CSV of all the transactions easily for the person who owned the bar, because they wanted to, for their accounts. They needed it for their accounts, and currently nodes didn't really provide that, which is crazy. So that's partly where Bits came from. So all the useful stuff comes from having Bitcoin running out there in the wild, and now Bitcoin is running out there in the wild. And I'm sure other countries will look at that guy paying his electricity bill instantly from his phone. They're more likely to be able to pull in those resources. Countries are, if there's less friction for people to make those payments. So I'm sure that example is going to resonate with other other countries in that region which have got poor infrastructure. But yeah, the apolitical nature of Bitcoin is my biggest thrill. I mean, I know that a lot of the sort of CIA destabilization shenanigans have stopped, and they sort of focused more on the Middle East in recent years. But honestly, I mean, you see it now in the Middle East with, people pulling out of Afghanistan. You create all this instability, and it takes a long time to get stability again. And that's why, like you say, maybe they're quite flighty in what they vote for, because it's just that's almost the definition of instability, isn't it? You can't really trust anything, so you have to just go with whatever option seems best at the time. You don't want to wait things out to stabilize and drift back towards the center a little bit more. So hopefully it will create more stability, and I do hope as well that they do make some sort of soft fiat currency, like an El Salvador currency, which people can just use as a medium of exchange. Think of it as a stable coin for El Salvador. I do hope that happens, just for the average person in El Salvador, so they don't have to use those dirty dollars. They can use this thing which is superior to the dirty dollar. Still a soft currency, so some people would argue it's still not as good as a hard currency, but it's still better than the other soft currency option they've got.
I mean, I suppose you're gonna get a lot of hate for this mention from the people who like to use the "I like Bitcoin, buy my shitcoin" quote on Twitter. But regardless, I'm really happy that we approached the topic and that we provided a little bit more nuance, and you turned out to be the more optimistic one. Actually, you're always the more optimistic one in every situation, including state.
Oh, shut up now! Don't say that's not true. I've got a horrible opinion of state. I just think they do a less terrible job in some functions than private capital, but not all. You wouldn't want state to produce your food. That's terrible when that happens.
But I'm not sure if I have any more questions for you, Ben, at this time.
Or your cars. Did the state do a good job? No, they do a terrible job at producing cars, don't they? Cars, fruit. I tell you what, they do a good job at is R&D, like public sector research and development. So if you look at most technologies out there, their foundations will be in publicly funded academic institutes like universities and research laboratories, where clever people have the time to kind of sit around and just develop stuff, which you don't get so much in. People want results, don't they, in the private sector world? Christ, look at the internet. It's developed in some university laboratory somewhere. So it does have a role, not states, public sector. But I don't know how what that would then go on to become, which was, a less buggy version of state, because there are also a lot of scientists and academics just sat around sponging off, off their high public sector wages.
I mean, if you want to, you can also take it back to the Renaissance and argue that you had the Medici and Borgias and all of these patrons of the arts, people who were disinterested in money but wanted to invest in something that will last throughout the centuries and is going to bring a glorification of their culture and is going to enrich the civilization as a whole. So
yeah,
I suppose
I wouldn't subscribe to that. There's a guiding small collection of incredibly wealthy people who produce all the culture we should value, and that's true.
I mean, I disagree that the state should produce all the value, because it can
No, I do
get
too.
propagandistic to the same extent.
Yeah, I do too. I agree with you very much.
But it's not like two people on a podcast are going to really change the world right now, but it's useful to tinker and consider.
I don't know, man. So like there's some things which there's some, you start playing around. So this technology, it's always been very heavily underdeveloped by people. There's not enough people building tools for Bitcoin, and it is the future, and it is, you are on the cutting edge of financial technology, aren't you? And there's very few people developing on it, so it's very easy to become like an innovator and come up with concepts. It's like, I remember there was that great, I think it was an Andreas Antonopoulos talk he did, where he was talking about the invention of the car, and when they first produced the first car, there was like a design bias, which is they didn't have. It took them a while to figure out that they could use a wheel, for steering wheel. Like they would just continue to use ropes because on horses they used ropes. So when they got rid of the horse, they thought, well, we'll just carry on using ropes, And then after a short period, they're like, actually, a wheel's better. The steering wheel's better. And I think there's a lot of that in Bitcoin. Like we're so used to this clunky legacy finance payments, privately owned payment networks that our expectations and like what we think it can do or money can do is very limited, because we're like breaking new ground. We're like in that computer game, like just going into the black bits on the map. We don't know what's in front of us. So that's very thrilling. And it's also very easy to kind of come up with. It's just like, oh, look, I can do this thing with the technology. And then afterwards you're like, oh my God, that might be the missing ingredient to make something work. So for example, it's funny because Fiat Jaff, who works on LM Bits, you'll hate this. So I love the fact that what the two main contributors on LM Bits is me, who's quite left-leaning, let's be honest, and then Fiat Jaff, his tagline on Twitter is leftism is a disease. So okay, so you've got these two people with like polar, pretty opposite viewpoints, but they're both working on the same piece of software. Anyway, he makes the split payments innovation, which he did with he did like a DJ extension. So there's a guy, Crypto Graffiti did like a DJ set, and then people could pay. One of the cool innovating things, there's a QR code on the screen, you could pay it, and then it would go towards the DJ, go towards Crypto Graffiti. But one of the innovations of the extension was that a percentage of that payment would instantly also go to the producer. So some would go to 20% would go to the DJ for playing the song, and then 80% would then go to the actual producer, so whoever produced the song, to their wallet. And you could kind of like set the wallet in the back end. So you had this payment splitting thing. So a couple of us, like in our Telegram thing, we were kind of, hypothetically thinking, well, there's something about splitting a payment at the point of sale, which is really interesting. And there's a few of us then who are like, well, can we not just have that as a standalone extension where, you have a wallet, and then you say any funds which come into this wallet, you split it across, these wallets, and this percentage in each one of these wallets. So we made that on Bits. Okay. So now I'm thinking about a micro venture cooperative coffee pop-up. And all the participants get together and say, okay, every coffee sale we get, we're selling we're at a Bitcoin conference, say, I don't know, because that's the only place you could do this, or maybe El Salvador. Every payment we get in Bitcoin, 10% will go to the cleaner, 10% will go to the guy on the coffee machine, the barista, 10% will go to the waiter, 30% will go to the cost of the venue, blah, blah, blah. I've lost my amounts now, so I don't know how much I've got left. But anyway, it could be kind of decided by the participants, like what percentage goes to each, a fair percentage goes to each department, and then maybe the guy, in the washing the dishes or the coffee cups, I suppose, maybe like they're clearly working really hard, and everyone's like feels a bit sorry for them, and like, dude, that dude should be getting like a few more percent because it's really working harder than, the waiters just sort of sat around chatting to people all day. They're not working so hard. Maybe they need a little bit more money. So you have these decisions which are made then over how those funds should be allocated in a way which is, it's a consensus among the group. and then they have to just, I suppose in this scenario, you've got a small group of people, so they can just decide amongst themselves. But then if you scale that up to a bigger scenario, then maybe you'd have to have some sort of voting mechanism, maybe. I don't know how you do that. But anyway, just that simple concept of split payments. You can't do it with Visa, because you can't do it for small payments. You can't do it for a few pennies. It doesn't make any rational sense. You can do it with Bitcoin and Lightning. You can do it for sub pennies. So you're then starting to develop that steering wheel over, and you're then making the tools, which we were saying before about something like a cooperatives is really hard to do. Maybe it's less hard to do when you've got like a payment being split instantly and going into people's wallets, and maybe that's a great motivator. When you're working in the back end and you see the amount in your wallet going up. Maybe that's a great motivator to put more people on the front line, have more salespeople. I don't know. So, yeah, it's although we're just a couple of speculators, by speculating about these things, you can end up stumbling across very powerful tools which could go on to become important.
Okay, I'm not sure if I agree with you, but I'm not going to.
Why don't you agree
either.
with me? Why don't you agree with me? Do you think it's all science fiction, load nonsense?
So I understand the argument for Bitcoin, but I'm not sure if it's going to get used like this. But let's.
Do you think it's more of a health in the bank back end thing?
I don't like that either, but I can see why it's happening, and I can see why there's this culture of centralizing around companies and banks and having services that require a degree of trust. Bitcoin was created to maybe not entirely eliminate trust, but minimize trust. But it seems that as we get to a greater amount of adoption, we seem to trust services and developers and institutions a lot more. And don't get me started on all of that Michael Saylor cult or everything else happening around, which is very much against the ethos of early Bitcoiners. And part of the reason why I've decided to do this season about philosophy is just to remind people why we are here and why we decided to stick around. So I think this is going to be my last question for you. What kept you going? Because obviously you don't find yourself harmonizing with much of the community, and you seem to disagree a lot with people who are around. So what is it that keeps you going, and why did you just not rage quit into Ethereum or something?
Well, this is dissident technology, and like you say, the community of Bitcoin is originally they're all dissidents. There's plenty of like far left socialist types in Bitcoin early on, and also if I go to like a conference, I'll find plenty of people who think very similar way to me, and then I'll also find a hell of a lot of people who think the complete opposite, but they're very receptive to discussion. And going back to our mate Hegel, I think that is how you having that dialectic and reaching synthesis of ideas is how society people progress forward. So you can have like an outliner or what appears, in like Bitcoin Twitter land as an outliner viewpoint, but actually, in real life, you can have very rewarding conversations with people, and then also over the internet you can have very rewarding conversations with people where you exchange ideas, and you can it's I don't feel like I'm like isolated in my little lefty bubble, far from it, and then ultimately, like, it doesn't matter, like if I believe that society is going to move in a certain direction, like we're going to decentralize everything and we're going to have a free and open source society, and that includes private ownership over capital, right? So if I believe that, and if someone else believes that, no, actually, private capital and is the basis for why this technology works, and will create equilibrium and society will be great, and they're coming from that angle, we're both just building tools, aren't we? I'm building tools, they're building tools. Take Josh, for example, like he's got this Voltoro, it's great. People can switch in and out Bitcoin and gold. It's pretty cool. And then he's also very active building a whole bunch of other tools too. And then equally, he appreciates me and what I'm doing, with my software and hardware, and what I'm focusing my efforts on as well. So it doesn't really matter ultimately that we have these different opinions. with free and open source software and hardware, if you build a tool, if people like it and they use it, then, whatever. It just doesn't matter. None of it matters. It'll all just keep moving in whatever direction it's going to move in anyway. Who knows who's right? Maybe we're both right. Maybe we'll find synthesis and we'll move in find some way of, moving in a joint direction. I don't know. But yeah, so that's why. And then I think as well, a lot of people like Rage, like Vitalik, for example. He's a Bitcoiner. He has Ethereum and he develops Ethereum and he keeps talking about, this ETH2 thing, which is never going to, doesn't seem to, it's never going to happen. But he worked, you've worked with Bitcoin Magazine yourself, didn't you? He was the editor of that for years, and he had lots of Bitcoin for years, and he's a real passionate Bitcoin for years. He just became impatient that the stuff in the promise, these smart contracts and those sort of Nick Szabo-y, like hypothetical promises which would exist to make society better, that stuff was dead hard to do on Bitcoin. And he just became impatient and made some shitcoin. So as soon as that stuff comes back onto Bitcoin, that dude's going to come back to Bitcoin. That's the thing he's interested in. And he probably still likes Bitcoin, but he's obviously not public about it because he can't be public about it. So I think a lot of these like shitcoiners who've rage quit from Bitcoin, I think the inevitable circle back round will happen. It's just a matter of time. We just got to keep making the software better.
I think that's a good explanation, which can be summed up to the fact that it's not that hard for you to find like-minded people, and possibly Bitcoin Twitter is not the most representative way of figuring out who the community members are. So that's the first part of it. And you also mentioned that there were lots of early Bitcoiners who were also leaning towards the left, the radical left, that is. And also that the Bitcoiners who moved on to other projects like Vitalik and Zuko and all of these people who got impatient about features that Bitcoin does not have, you're certain that whenever we integrate them into Bitcoin, they're going to be back. And I think that Zuko is going to be back. I don't think Vitalik is going to give up so easily, just because he has made... I mean, he could have never achieved this degree of success if he remained a Bitcoiner. And we have to be aware that his incentives are stacked against becoming a Bitcoiner once again. He is the captain of this ship, right? He wants to take it as far as it can get. And it turned out to be an unscalable clusterfuck. That's a whole different situation. That's a different debate. Maybe he's going to get it right the second time, even though it turns out to be an oligarchy where...
Have you seen the ETH2 thing? Have you seen like the proposal on how they're going to move from ETH1 to ETH2? Have you actually read it? Jesus Christ, it's the most terrifying thing.
Did anything change recently?
Oh, my stomach was turning whenever I think I read it about a month ago, whatever this proposal was. So unless anything's happened in the past month since I last looked, I don't know.
Okay, go on. Like, this can be interesting. What did you find about this transition?
It just made my stomach turn. It was just the complexity of it and what the users would have to do in order to move to ETH2. You're going to tell me they've moved to ETH2 now, aren't you? Have they moved to ETH2?
I guess there's a lot of information asymmetry, or how do you pronounce it? Asymmetry. That the developers are trying to exploit to the greatest extent. And also the exchanges are trying to exploit, because the exchanges are some of the biggest investors in the project. They are the biggest stakers in the second version of the Ethereum project. And most likely that they want to have it all figured out and sorted out by the time the network launches. So they benefit from all of the advantages.
You've seen that like 2017 conference talk, Vitalik, before he does his talk, where he's rapping on stage. Have you seen that?
Oh, yeah.
About ETH? Yeah, you've seen that. And ETH2's like, yeah, it's going to happen soon. Next 6 months. And that was then, 2017.
It's always fun to see them just backpedal on some features.
But it's so messy and hacky. This is why I just don't think it will ever happen. It's terrifying looking. honestly. I couldn't read the whole thing. Go check it out. It's just that what would have to happen? I mean, aren't you essentially like burning your ETH to get ETH 2? Aren't you just? Isn't that pretty much how it works? It's very scary stuff. Drive chains support BIP 300. We have a new extension on LM-Bits called Hive Mind, and you can't use it because it doesn't exist, because it can't exist because we haven't got drive chains. So we need drive chains, and then we can have blind merge mining and things, and we can. So in the example, is it Paul Shorts? Paul Shorts gave Slorts. Say it for me.
Storts.
Paul Storts. The example he gives is he made Zcash, didn't he, on Bitcoin? Just boom, knocked it out. There you are.
As a side chain.
As a side chain. So why do you need Zcash? You could just make a new Zcash, which is better. Hasn't got that crazy developer reward thing, founders reward thing. Or you could do a Monero. Like Monero, I like Monero, but I mean it's got issues, obviously, and it would be better if a lot of these things were, because there's plenty of impatient people have gone off and used inferior technologies to build houses on sand, and these altcoin experiments, which you can just bring back around to Bitcoin, and drive chains will allow a lot of this, and it's got a lot of support from people. The only people who don't support are the people who don't want to see, who are like proper maximalist types and just don't want to see any altcoin to exist ever, or alternative use. But that's the inevitable evolution of this software, isn't it? Is for us to have smart contracts and different sort of different variations of how Bitcoin works. It's going to happen eventually. So yeah, just support drive chains, BIP 300, get it all on Bitcoin, baby. Make Zuko come back, make Zcash irrelevant, make Monero irrelevant, make Ethereum irrelevant.
That's a great message to end this. And I've had Paul Storts 2 episodes ago. He spoke about everything from the trade-offs to the advantages. To me, this is like the epitome of the maximalist idea or the maximalist movement, because you have two camps. You have the one that thinks that Bitcoin is perfect as is, and specifically thanks to its immaculate conception and the way that it was developed, it's the only one that's going to succeed, and no matter what comes out, it's not going to have the same primitives, and therefore it's useless to tinker with other types of technologies. And then there's the second camp, the branch of maximalism, which says that Bitcoin is going to encapsulate everything that exists in altcoins right now. So basically, altcoins are experiments that are going to get turned into side chains if they turn out to be useful in any way, and there's going to be a community that demands for that kind of activity to exist. And I tend to adhere to this idea that Bitcoin is going to eat up all of these use cases because it has the most secure network, it has the hardest money, and it makes the most sense, as opposed to what you said, that you have houses built on sand. So yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to have drive chains because the developers seem to be torn about it. And we did not have this kind of situation with Schnorr signatures where everyone agreed that they are superior. And we had the first wave with Taproot, and even that took 2 years to merge. And I suppose that drive chains is going to be something that can take up to 10 years or something, 5 at best. And that only happens if also the developers agree. Right now, you have at least 2 very influential voices that are critical. One of them is Greg Maxwell, and the other one is Peter Todd. And they think that this is a terrible idea which threatens the security of the Bitcoin base layer. And we shall see. I don't know. I'm not an expert to debate on this topic at a very high level.
No, it's I mean, the people who want additional functionality on Bitcoin will probably get that in some other way through like space chains or something, and I don't know, which I think enabled by Taproot. I don't know.
I gotta go open the door. Sorry. Be right back.
That's cool.
I'm back. Sorry. I usually
have-
record my interviews at night for this exact reason that nobody bothers me. Nobody ever calls or
Oh, it's fine.
knocks at the door.
It's probably a good cue, isn't it? As always, I could rant on with you till whenever. I think we should just talk indefinitely. I hope to see you in Mallorca. We'll have a good chat there over beer.
Yeah, I can't wait for that event. And it's funny to me that you have all of these blockchain week events in Europe where if you go there, you're going to see that most of the participants are hardcore maximalists. And you go in the USA to events that claim to be Bitcoin only, and then you're going to look at the sponsors and you realize, okay, this is kind of shady. And then you get a couple of speakers who get on stage and they talk about Ethereum Max or something like you have seen with Floyd Mayweather and others. So yeah, it's kind of...
Did they do that? Did they do that at BTC in Miami, did they?
They had Floyd Mayweather who got on stage and started doing his shtick because he was trying to sell his NFT or something. So yeah, he promised the organizers that he would get on stage and announce that he would spend some of the money that he wins from the fight that he's going to have the next day to buy some BTC. But he never did that. He advertised his own venture and never left the bylines of saying, I'm the greatest of all times and you should all praise me and look at me, I'm so good. And you should spend your money on stuff that is related to my existence.
I found the... So, I mean, they tried the BTC, the Bitcoin conference in 2019 in San Francisco. I set up a little hackerspace because I felt there was nowhere for me to go and sit down and work on my computer and also do workshops and stuff, just unofficially with people. And then me and Stepan Snikerov, we just sort of put some tables together and we had some workshops in a corner and it became super popular. And then this time around, I was like, can we have a more substantial area for makers? And they had this huge developer hacker tent called the Bitcoin Dome, which I was super excited about. I thought, there we are, good. Now every good conference now needs a hack space. It's really important it has a hack space. From what I hear, though, because I wasn't able to go, which was terrible because of the COVID stuff. But from what I hear is the AC was completely inefficient. So it was absolutely sweltering and it was really uncomfortable to be in there. And I felt terrible because Christian Rutzel, he was running pretty much the whole thing, the Bitcoin Dome, because I wasn't able to get there and there's only a few of us involved in the organization of it. And I felt so bad because he was just in this really sweaty tent, which the organizers didn't seem to care too much about. I mean, they paid for this tent, which was great, but it's just I don't know. I think there should, hopefully there's some lessons which have been learned there. But in Europe, when you go to these European Bitcoin conferences are like, I like the energy a bit more. It's lots of free and open source people. It's lots of people playing or exchanging ideas. You're kind of also more likely to have a private moment with a Peter Todd or maybe not Peter Waller because he never goes to them, but an Adam Back or something. You're more likely to have a private moment where you can have a chat with them, like in a bar or something. Whereas I did find in some of the American ones, there does seem to be the VIP section and then the sort of the pleb section, whereas you don't get that in Europe so much. They have a little backstage area, but there's more mingling going on, which is cooler for idea exchanging. So yeah, I'm fully with you. The European conference scene is ace, and I particularly like the hack days and things which Jeff Fulmo does and Christian Russell do in Berlin, not just in Germany but around the world. But yeah, there's definitely a good scene in Europe, which I think is probably reflected in the amount of nodes. Like if you look at the node maps, I think Germany has the highest per capita node, Bitcoin nodes running. So I hope that the US adopt that. It was actually quite interesting. So I know we do need to end this at some point, but the Bitcoin Dome, so basically the only people who could talk there or could present there, even though it must have been horrific to do because it was so hot in there, they were all free and open source projects, and more or less all of them were from Europe. like the US really need to up their game. So I think in the US, if you have like an idea, you're like, oh, I'm going to make a business around this idea. I'm going to get some VC funding, move to Austin, Texas. Whereas I think the Europeans, if they have an idea, they're like, cool, I've got this idea. I'm going to make some hacky little, Telegram signal group and, try and organize some free and open source developers and refuse to ever make a profitable enterprise. And they make this sort of free and open source. They go down this free and open source route. So it'd be nice if the US kind of picked up a bit more of the free and open source stuff from us Europeans.
I cannot disagree with you on this one. Even if I wanted, I cannot disagree.
And I know you like to disagree, so that's good.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole point.
Yes.
I hate podcasts where everyone agrees the whole time.
Oh, the circle jerks. The worst one for me is Bitcoin panels at conferences. An American conference, Bitcoin conference with a Bitcoin panel, where they're all just sat around talking about how great Bitcoin is. I'm just like these, supposed thought leader types, and I it makes me cringe. I hate it. I hate panels, and particularly that type of panel. So boring.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, Ben, this has been like 2 hours and 10 minutes long. I don't have any more questions for you. And I'm pretty sure that you have some coding to do that you're not doing because of my stupid interview.
No, it's been loads of fun. It's been nice, man. But I know I have. We've got like a crazy amount of PRs going on LM Bits at the moment, and it's eating all my time. I need to kind of get more people to, join in on the PR. But basically, there's loads of people submitting extensions. So for more functionality on LM Bits.
I see all the time trying to moderate discussions on the LM Bits Telegram group, and it just makes me wonder, when does this guy have any time left to actually code?
What, me? Oh, right, yeah. Not very much, no. So I need to do less of that. It's just interesting though. Like that's I like the LM Bits Telegram chat. There's some good people in there, and the amount of support in there. And I tell you what, so we have a tip jar. Let me tell you this last thing. We have a tip jar on LM Bits Telegram group for if someone gets support, it's like do us a favor, send us some tips. And then what I do is I just split the tips up. So the people who are kind of most useful in the Telegram group, I just split the tips among them. Anyway, we had like an eye-watering amount of tips, which was amazing. It was just reinstated my opinion of how good human beings are, because people have just given an anonymous currency and not told me, and it accumulated to quite a decent sum of like chunk of change, right? So I'm then like, okay, so we find the sort of 5, 6 people who've kind of been the most productive and useful and helpful on the Telegram group. And we're like, well, these people, they're just free and open source. They're doing it for nothing. So and they have helped the people who've given the tips. So these people need the tips. I had to like individually plead with them for days to take the tips. Like, and then some of them I just had to tip, like, I don't know, rape them. I just had to like send them, go on LNTX bot and then just send them the tips through LNTX bot in a way where I think they probably just put it back in the tip jar, to be honest. Honestly, I couldn't give them the money, just wouldn't take it. I'm like, look, these are tips people have given for what you guys have done, being super helpful in the support thing. And then they just wouldn't take it. So it's a good little group of people over there. So if anyone's interested in LM Bits, then do pop on the Telegram group.
Okay. So thank you very much, Ben. If you like what Ben has said in this recording, you can follow him on Twitter at ArcBTC, I think.
I think so. And it's the same on GitHub too.
And he also has the Nostr. Nostr, how do you pronounce it?
Nostr. So it's notes and other stuff. That's the abbreviation. Relays. Notes and other stuff relays. That's the So it's abbreviates to Nostr, which is a communication protocol for sending information, which uses this relay system, which I won't go into too much detail over because we'll never get to say goodbye. But yeah, it's pretty cool. But although heavily underdeveloped, so if you're into free and open source decentralized communication protocols, then join in the Nostar chat. I think it's on Telegram, just Nostar, Nostr. Just join us.
Okay, so I'll talk to you later, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers, man. Thanks, Vlad. Let's speak to you again.
Golden Bitcoin, 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 golden Bitcoin. Voltoro.
Wasabi Wallet's innovative coin joins will make your bitcoins more fungible. So if you accumulate more than 0.1 BTC, you can mix it with other users to remove all traces about their whereabouts. So it's like putting multiple fingerprints on your dollar bills, and it becomes impossible to determine the last few owners of the money. Download Wasabi Wallet today and start coin joining.